Welcome to the Selfseeker channel. Today I'm joined by Dr. Denholm Adventure-Heart, a psychologist and a researcher exploring the leading edge of psychedelic-assisted therapy in Australia. Denholm combines rigorous scientific inquiry with deep compassion and a strong grounding in contemplative traditions such as Zen Buddhism. He is a TEDx speaker and the lead author of the International Lucid Dream Induction Study, the world's largest research project on how people can reliably learn to lucid dream. He has also conducted research into the psychological benefits of mindfulness and loving-kindness meditation, helping to bridge inner transformation with outer evidence. Denholm's therapeutic work is trauma-informed, neurodivergent affirming, and spiritually integrated. He is a passionate advocate for ethical, intentional use of plant medicines and other psychedelics, and his mission is to help people heal, grow, and reconnect with their core potential. Dr. Adventure-Heart, welcome.
Thank you, Nick. It's a pleasure to speak with you again for another of your amazing upcoming conferences.
Thank you. Fantastic. So, I'm just curious, how long did this study take you? You've been a psychologist for a while now, so...
The study of psychology has, in a sense, it's been a lifelong pursuit. I became fascinated by mostly Eastern psychology, actually, in my late teens, when I had a very big period of self-development and change, and discovered Buddhism and spent some time traveling Vietnam with a monk, which I think you already know about that story. So in that sense, psychology has been a lifelong passion, but in terms of formal study, I started my Bachelor of Psychology in around 2021, I think. And since then I've done, cumulatively, it's about 12 years of full-time study. So I've done the PhD, after the Bachelor in Honours, where I studied meditation. In the PhD I studied lucid dreaming, as you know, and also benefits of meditation, which you mentioned. Then I was a counsellor for a short time, did some volunteering at Lifeline, and then went back to the University of Queensland to do my Master of Clinical Psychology. So now I am involved in some research-related activity as well as private practice as a psychologist. And this is, of course, my office, which I have the pleasure of having you in for today. And that leads me to where I am now, with a huge lifelong fascination for various ways of exploring the mind, like meditation, dreaming, and plant medicines and psychedelics. And I guess that brings us to here, where I'm going to be, again, speaking for your conference on plants as medicine.
Fantastic. All interesting and exciting topics. Could you tell our audiences and me, what is lucid dreaming really?
Lucid dreaming is when you know for sure that you're dreaming while the dream is still happening. And people often get a little confused and think a lucid dream is when it's very clear or very vivid, and typically they are clear and vivid, but lucidity, by definition, we're talking about knowing you're dreaming when you're still asleep in that dream. And that opens the potential to control the dream, do intentional actions such as healing, even work with PTSD and trauma in that dream environment, as well as develop creative abilities and gain self-insight. It's like having your own personal virtual reality in your own mind, and if you can learn the skill of how to access it.
I see. Wow. And Zen Buddhism, was that something that you were led into by the monk you interacted with in Vietnam?
That happened organically. I was already learning about Buddhism, and I went to a monastery in Adelaide where he was the head monk, and he was teaching free classes on meditation. And then one day he announced he was going to Vietnam, and I tell this story in my TEDx talk in more depth, but basically I immediately put my hand up and I said, yes, can I go? And about 4 or 5 weeks later I was on a plane to Vietnam. And it was incredible. I went to orphanages and temples and hospitals, because he was there doing humanitarian work, giving away donations he'd received. And I got to witness that, and it was a very enlightening experience.
Fantastic. So, just for the sake of our audiences that are not familiar, what are psychedelics, and I was wondering if you could help us dispel some of the common misconceptions that might prevent people from considering them as legitimate medicine.
That's a great question, and it's one that many have asked, and there are different answers to it. If you look at the word itself, psychedelic, it approximately translates to mind manifesting. You know, the psyche, mind, and the delic. Don't know the exact translation, but it's often said that the word translates to mind manifesting. And so in this sense, you can think of psychedelics as, one, they're psychoactive. So unlike, for example, having a Panadol, if you have a headache, you don't really notice much except hopefully a little bit of pain relief. But for a psychedelic, it causes an altered state of consciousness. And the classics are things like LSD, psilocybin from magic mushrooms, mescaline from the peyote cactus and other cacti in that region. And then you've also got purely pharmaceutical psychedelics, such as ketamine. We've got LSD is synthesized from a fungus, but it doesn't occur in nature as far as we know. It's in that form. MDMA, some people argue that is or isn't a psychedelic, but I'd say that it is, based on just how profoundly mind-altering and transformative it can be. And we find psychedelics in both nature and from the laboratory. And occasionally we even find one that we thought was just in the lab, and then we'll find it in nature somewhere. So that's happened a few times too. So that's a bit of a longer answer, but that's in a nutshell, I think, what psychedelics could be defined as.
And there seem to be a few misconceptions around psychedelics. Would you like to address any of them?
Ooh, where do we start? Psychedelics have been such a controversial topic throughout history, and especially as we know from, Timothy Leary didn't do us any favors with his evangelical promotion of the benefits of psychedelics, and saying things like we should put it in town water supply to evolve humanity's consciousness, and who knows what effect that would have had, but I'm certain it would have been chaotic, not to mention deeply unethical for people to be drinking acid out of it without knowing, So there's been a few characters like this that have freaked out governments and policymakers, not to mention that there are real dangers and harms when people don't know what they're doing. These medicines are powerful. And so amongst all of that and the fear of things like just say no to drugs and these now outdated ways of thinking, but the remnants still remain. But we're in a very wonderful time with psychedelic medicine because we've learned from our mistakes. We've seen how bad it went when people got overly excited, and like Leary, for example. And now we see scientists and therapists taking a very grounded, methodical scientific approach where harm minimization and safety is paramount, and we're just starting to see just how profound the effects of plant medicines generally and psychedelics can be for people who are seeking self-development or healing. I have no doubt that these already are and will continue to be some of the most powerful tools in the psychiatrist's toolkit going forwards.
Yeah, wow, thank you. So, did you start looking into psychedelics after you got into the study, or did you try them before by yourself?
Yeah, so that, again, they sort of happened together. So it was when I was in my about 19 or so, 18, 19, I just spent some time studying music, because I'm a musician as well, as you know. I was studying music full time, and it's a bit of a stereotype or cliche, but I got introduced to certain substances, starting with cannabis, and then I started doing research. I've always been one to do research, and when I read the experience reports of people using psychedelics and some of the incredible experiences I was reading about it just inspired me so much. And so my study and my training in Buddhism and Zen and meditation, it kind of coincided with some of this inner exploration I was doing too. And so, I'm with the caveat in mind that I'm not saying do this at home, but as an explorer of the mind myself, I have mapped the terrain, so to speak, with numerous substances, and I credit that for a lot of my own healing and my own where I am today. I think the key is to just know what you're doing, to be very careful and safe, and to treat these substances with deep respect, because some of the experiences I've had have been challenging, to say the least.
Yeah.
And I've at times been grateful for that meditation training to be able to stay centered during what has been sometimes a very intense, like a bad trip, essentially.
I see. Thank you. What is the current state of psychedelic medicine in Australia, and how are everyday Aussies able to access these treatments legally right now?
That's a great question, and it's one that I intend to talk more about in the talk at your conference, because people are crying out for these medicines. I get requests from people all the time saying, how do I legally access this? Do I have to sign up for a research study? Can I see it through a psychiatrist? What do I have to do? The short answer is it is accessible legally in Australia. One avenue is to participate in trials, but it's a harder one in some ways because criteria can be stringent and it takes time for studies to get off the ground and whatnot. The other main path is you can access ketamine, mostly for depression, and you can access both psilocybin from magic mushrooms and MDMA, commonly called ecstasy, but of course that's just a street name. The drug itself, when it's pharmacologically pure and carefully administered in a supervised setting, can actually be quite safe, unlike buying something off the street where you don't actually know what's in it. So you can get these through a psychiatrist, but it's challenging. Not every psychiatrist does it. In fact, they have to apply for a special license, and usually you have to have tried, I think it might be 3 other medications like antidepressants and whatnot, and have had them not work to then be eligible for this more sort of innovative therapy as it stands in our current system. So long story short, you can access it, but it's usually tricky and a few hoops to jump through, and it can be expensive.
Yeah, okay. So how do you define a medicine as working or not working?
That's a great question. I think there's multiple ways. You want to really look at what is the desired outcome of the medicine. So as a psychologist, what I would do just in my routine work with every client, you start with baseline assessments. So you might do something like a depression, anxiety and stress scale, or various other measures of symptoms to see where the person's at right now. And then whatever the therapy is, whether it includes psychedelics or not, then after the treatment, and after some time to do integration work and whatnot, then you would re-administer the same measures, see if we've had a reduction in symptom scores. We combine that with clinical interview, where you ask the person, hey, how did you go with this? How is your life going? Is your ability to function or do what you want to do in life better? Is your depression better? Through clinical interview as well. And then, of course, there's more sort of objective biological markers. So you could look at things like stress hormones or heart rate or things like that during a session to try to monitor what kind of effect this is having on someone. So there's lots of different ways, but usually what we find with psychedelics is usually the effect is pretty clear. They're usually, it's not, put it this way, it's not uncommon for people to have a psychedelic experience and come back saying it's one of the biggest experiences they've ever had in their whole life. So it's often not hard to pick up that it's had some kind of effect.
And this effect, is that seen straight away or over a period of months? What's the time frame?
Often it's quite quick, especially compared to some of our traditional, especially antidepressants, which are known to usually take weeks or even longer to build up in the system and start having noticeable effects on mental health symptoms. Often with psychedelics, it depends which one we're talking about, but usually a single session can bring about radical transformation. And part of this is thought to be mediated by its direct influences on the brain. Temporarily down-regulating parts of the brain involved in fear, which gives the person a chance to reprocess memories and other experiences without all of this emotional heat coming up. Deep self-insight, changes in core beliefs, all of this can happen in a single day with a big psychedelic experience. And then we've got things like ketamine, which is a fascinating substance, a dissociative anesthetic. When used for depression, this can provide rapid relief. You can have alleviation of quite severe depression symptoms, even suicidality, can be alleviated within a session, and usually that can last for days or even weeks afterwards. We currently have different protocols of using ketamine in that way, but usually you have a few maintenance doses every week or twice a week. There's different ways of doing it, but short answer, results can be quite rapid.
So how does depression affect people generally?
Profoundly, a lot. I've worked with a lot of people with depression. I've experienced some periods of depression myself, which I'm actually personally grateful for. It helps me understand and empathize with others. Depression can be truly awful. Imagine losing your sense of joy. One of the key criteria is called anhedonia, which means like an is non, and then hedonia is like joy, like hedonism. Anhedonia is one of the key symptoms of depression, and it basically means that things that would normally bring you joy and meaning just feel empty and devoid of feeling. And then you've also got things like it impacts self-esteem, it impacts ability to function. Sometimes it's so bad that people can't get out of bed because they're just unwell. And for someone who doesn't get it, looking from the outside, it can look like, well, why don't you just get out of bed and start doing things? No wonder you're depressed. But that's the catch-22. The depression makes it harder to do the things that would help get out of the depression. So depression is quite an awful affliction, especially when it's severe. And that's another reason why psychedelics are so exciting, because they show promise to help alleviate depressive symptoms very quickly and with minimal dangers or risks, as long as it's done safely and in a professional setting.
So if someone was taking psilocybin to treat their depression, are there side effects they need to be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. So with any medicine, there's always some side effects to be cautious of. Even something as innocuous as Panadol, like we said, paracetamol, takes a bit of a toll on the liver if you take it for too much, just for one example. Psilocybin, some of the main things you want to be careful with is, for one thing, it can be a powerful psychological experience. So if someone, for example, has a family history of psychosis, then that might be a contraindication for that person, because we might be concerned that it could bring on some kind of mental health episode. So you want to have a fairly firm tether to reality, and you want to screen people carefully before giving them such powerful medicines. Same with things like MDMA can increase heart rate and blood pressure, so we need to be careful of anyone that has heart problems. There's lots of things like that, but by and large, compared to a lot of other things that are handed out quite easily, psychedelics are generally considered to not be amongst the most harmful things you could have, put it that way. They're generally well tolerated as long as you screen people carefully.
I see. Thank you. For someone struggling with depression, PTSD and chronic anxiety, what conditions are showing the most promise with psychedelic-assisted therapy, and what does research tell us? If you know.
Yeah. This is really interesting. It's one of the big questions, because we're trying to figure out right now, like, how many people can we help, and how do we use these medicines in the most effective way? Do we combine it with talk therapy, or do we just let someone process internally with a blindfold and headphones on? And it's often a combination. Let people process and experience as they will, and have people on site to help. But with disorders, some of the most promising, we've got depression, PTSD, especially using MDMA for PTSD, end-of-life fear, psilocybin, there's a lot of research around that. But then there's also research coming out about things like eating disorders, I guess like subclinical issues where maybe it's chronic low self-esteem, but it doesn't quite reach a full depression. Even things like this can be benefited. MDMA has been used historically in like marriage counseling, because it's such an empathy-inducing substance. It can really help people work through conflict and problems. The list goes on, but yeah, a lot of promising work coming out. Yeah, which I'll of course talk about more at the conference, and share some of these latest findings and the actual results.
So, which country or countries are doing research in this field at the moment?
There's many. So Australia is doing really well globally. We're quite progressive with our laws, especially with psilocybin and MDMA being now legally accessible through psychiatrists. There's a lot happening in the US, there's a lot happening in various countries in Europe. It's sort of scattered all over the world. There's little hubs and pockets of people doing really good work.
That's good to know.
Yeah, it's an exciting time for this field.
Fantastic. So, what should someone know about safety before considering psychedelic therapy, and what red flags should people look out for when seeking treatment?
Great questions. So, what should someone know about safety, first of all? Well, the answer is a lot. So, you want to know what you're doing. You want to be prepared for it. This is why usually, when it is done in clinical settings, you have a few preparatory sessions first to help the person understand and prepare, to make sure that there aren't any red flags, like you said, like possible psychosis, or maybe they're taking something else that could be hazardous with the certain psychedelic they're having. So contraindicated substances or medications, that's one. Being very careful of what's called set and setting. So most psychonauts will know this term well. It refers to your psychological set, which is your environment. So for example, a room like this where it's comfortable and well lit, this might be a fairly comfortable place to do something like this. The middle of a rave in the CBD, when you don't have any friends around, is probably one of the worst places you could do an acid trip or something, because it's chaotic and there's a lot of unknown variables. So making sure you're in a safe, comfortable setting, and then your psychological set is the other area to look really carefully at with safety. So you want to be ready for the experience. You want to ideally spend a bit of time grounding and have an intention, and have support from other people to feel safe. If you're feeling really freaked out and paranoid, then it might be best to have another preparation session and work through some of that first. So those are some of the basic things to be on the lookout. Most of the hazards, when you screen for things like high blood pressure and other medications and whatnot, most of the hazards are usually more psychological. So you're probably not going to die or anything, as long as you don't do something really silly like buy ecstasy off the street and have a huge dose by yourself or something. But it's mostly psychological, because it can be intense. So again, another reason why it's worth doing it with a professional in a legal, legitimate setting, or at the very least, if you are going to do these things yourself, which, let's face it, many people do. If you're going to do that, still make sure that you're around some really trusted people, that you've thought through some scenarios, you know how you're going to get some help if you need it. These are some of the things I'd be saying to people as harm minimization. And just educate yourself too, like what does the drug do, how does it work, how long does it last for, things like that.
Brilliant, thank you. Could you walk us through a typical psychedelic-assisted therapy session? What would it look like?
Well, it's not an easy question to ask, because there isn't really a standard, typical... people are exploring lots of ways of doing this. So, but one of the classic ones is, one of the most classic ways to do it is you have a few preparation sessions after you've screened the person with like a questionnaire or an initial chat. Then you have a few sessions to prepare, and during that time you would explore what they're coming for. So let's say it's PTSD. So you do a bit of assessment, you would explore the PTSD, get a sense of what's going on, understand the person's mind, get that familiarity between the client and the therapists. And then after a few sessions of preparing and education around the substance, then there's the day of the experience. And that usually will involve coming to a clinical setting that's set up to look nice and comfortable, and then taking the dose and then having people there with you the whole time. So you're talking maybe 6 hours, maybe longer. Sometimes they let you stay the night. And then afterwards, there's some integration that happens. So you usually have up to 3 sessions, maybe even more, where you talk through what happened. And this is really key to psychedelic-assisted therapy. And it makes me think of one of my favorite sayings, which is that the real work of psychedelics is to transform flashes of illumination into abiding light. So in these psychedelic experiences, you might glimpse the profound and the sacred and meet your ancestors or God, or who knows what's going to happen. It could be big and profound, but then the drug wears off. Yeah. So then is the real work to take, what have I learned from this, what are the insights, and how do I then change my life conditions to support a continuation of these benefits. Yeah, so that's the essence of integration work.
So you continue the benefits after the session is done.
Exactly, yeah. So let's say one of the, you take MDMA and you have this great profound realization that, wow, I really don't understand people's feelings enough and I really want to. That's a great insight. But then if you don't follow through with doing something to improve your awareness of people or change your communication style or learn how to ask the right questions, then it's just an idea and an inspiration, So that's where the integration bit is really important.
I see. Well, you mentioned meeting God in a psychedelic experience. I'm just curious, have you met God?
Oh goodness, what do I say to that? Put it this way, like in a certain kind of sense, when I'm not forgetting, I see God everywhere I look. I think you can find God in the trash bin just as much as you can in a cathedral. I'm not tied to any specific religion, not even Buddhism, but I see the world and the universe as sacred in a quite a naturalistic, science-compatible sort of way. So it'd be a longer conversation to flesh that out, but yeah, I've had some very profound experiences with psychedelics as well. And incidentally, a lot of it's been informed by what I've learned from Ram Dass and his amazing book, Be Here Now, which I often tell people about. It's one of the best sources I found for my own spiritual journey and understanding of the world around me. He talks about psychedelics a lot too.
I see. I'm just curious, have you come upon entities during your psychedelic experiences?
That's a really interesting question, and I think that's one of the ones where there's that potential hazard of going into delusional thinking or something akin to psychosis. Now, just because someone says they meet entities or God or ancestors on psychedelics, it doesn't mean they're going crazy or there's anything wrong. People have been having experiences like this ever since we could talk about them. But having said that, if you go real deep with some of these things, the mind can be a bit of a trickster, and it's important to, whatever you experience and see, to hold it lightly. This is a really nice metaphor. Whatever comes up, just wow, look at that. All right, cool. I'm seeing this now. I'm speaking to some kind of entity. How about that? What can I learn from you whilst not getting too tangled up? Most people don't go crazy after seeing entities. It's usually just like, whoa, what is that? I've met some entities, you could say, that have felt like they're probably a projection of my own mind, and when I looked closely, I could see little hints that it was a projection from inside. There have been a few times where I've had the distinct experience of encountering another sentient entity. It felt completely benevolent. It felt like it was so vastly more superior in terms of intelligence and whatnot that I was basically like an ant compared to it. But at the same time, it was benevolent, and it's almost impossible to put into words. It was just so at odds with anything I've experienced in my waking reality that it's hard to even have language for it. What do I make of that? I don't really know. Again, I hold it lightly and say, wow, look at that. But there's many reports of others having similar things too, like meeting entities and beings and things.
So, when you're in the altered state under psychedelics, does it seem to give you perhaps a new power or a new capability or a new ability that you don't have normally? Have you noticed that?
Yes, in a sense. I'd say in terms of self-awareness, perspective. So I remember one of the times when I had a full ego death experience, which was extremely profound, one of the most profound experiences of my life. And after coming back from that, I remember just walking through the world with not like a problematic detachment, not the kind of like dissociation that you might get from trauma. In fact, I felt like I was more present than I'd ever been, but at the same time, I was almost completely detached from all the little things that would usually bother me and worry me. And I remember walking through a city, this was the day after, walking through a city with this newfound centered perspective. And I could just see on the faces of all the other people walking around, they're in their phones and they're frowning or they're hurrying and they're rushing, and you can just kind of almost see these little snapshots of human experience. And I just felt like I was just gliding through the whole thing. Like it didn't matter what happened, I was perfectly content, I was perfectly fine. And I was still able to study and function, it wasn't like I was still high or anything, but I think that is one of the greatest powers. It's nothing mysterious or supernatural, it was just the power of being centered and having perspective and being at ease in the world. So that's I guess my answer to that one. I'll let you know if I ever learn how to move objects with my mind or something, but that hasn't happened yet.
Fantastic. So have you come upon any interesting case studies where there's a big shift or transformation before and after psychedelics for one of your clients or someone else you read about that you could tell us?
Yeah, so there's lots of case studies in the literature. I've had a few from clients that I've done integration work with, where they've had an experience and then they've found me and said, I want some help to integrate and understand this. So I've seen some big changes. One really interesting one is the one from, what is it, what's his name, the mushroom guy. He did Fantastic Fungi.
Oh, okay, yes.
I
don't remember his name.
It's Paul Stamets. He spoke about his mushroom experience, and he somehow found his way up a tree during a lightning storm, apparently. Again, like, don't try this at home. He ended up in a tree, and there was this storm, and he said he had like a speech difficulty. He would like stutter. And after this, that was just gone. Like, he managed to work through that and put some intention into, like, I don't want to stutter anymore, and this is going to change, or forget the wording. He talks about it in the documentary. But that's one case where, something is, almost like a physical sounding thing, like a stutter, like a motor movement pattern. He was able to change and fix that under the influence of magic mushrooms somehow. So I don't know how that happened, but he reports that it did.
Wow. So do people need to go back to a psychedelic session after they've had one session, or do you think one is enough? How does it work?
That's interesting. I can certainly say that like I've said, I've had multiple myself, and I continue to see value in that. It depends on what your purposes are, really. If you're trying to treat a specific disorder and you come with PTSD and you have one session and you manage to dramatically heal and transform that, then one session might be enough, and then you might go home and never be interested again or never need to. Other people sometimes need repeated doses, especially for more complex or like more baked in kind of psychological difficulties from childhood. Might take multiple sessions to progressively untangle and process the underlying stuff related to that. So yeah, it does depend on the person and the situation.
Okay, so the cost of treatment for a psychedelic session in Australia, how much are we talking, and are there pathways for those who can't afford it?
Yeah, so that's an area where we still need to do a lot more work. It's moving slowly because we're being cautious, and I think that's probably a good thing, honestly, because they are powerful medicines. But at the same time, there's a lot of desperate need for these medicines, like decades ago, and now if possible. So it's this difficult balance between a lot of need and a lot of good that could be done, but also making sure we get it right and do it carefully and in an evidence-based way. In terms of cost, you can do it cheaply by participating in a study if you can get into one. If you do it through a psychiatrist, it depends on what psychedelic you're using, but it can be quite expensive. You can do a ketamine in session for usually less than $1,000. If we're talking in a more in-depth MDMA or psilocybin session, it could be thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars, depending on how and where it's all set up.
Yeah, so for those who can't afford it, then they would need to look at clinical trials, possibly?
Yeah, pretty much. And like I said, the reality is some people will do it by themselves, which is financially cheap, but then you don't have all this professional support and this scaffolding, and there's much more potential for things to go awry. Not to mention that you don't know what's in the substance you're getting because it's not pharmaceutical grade. So if people do go down that path, then again, just educate yourself, learn as much as you can, emphasize harm minimization. You can always have more next time, but you can't take it out. So start small, and just all this kind of, harm reduction stuff is really important if people are going to try things at home.
So how does one find legitimate qualified practitioners in Australia, and what credentials would they look for?
Yeah, so at this point it's pretty much there'll have to be a psychiatrist involved, as far as I understand, especially for the MDMA and the psilocybin. So there'll be a psychiatrist, and then there will usually be, if you've got them, you might have a nurse, you might have a psychologist or two, you might even have a counsellor, or but it's all sort of within this medical professional framework. In terms of finding them, there's resources online to be able to find them. So the Australian Psychedelic Society has a lot of resources, and as you mentioned, they run the chapter here in Brisbane for the APS. There's also Mind Medicine Australia. They have a lot of great resources and connections with therapists. I'd start with those two, and you can find lists of studies that are currently accepting participants, and you can also find psychedelic trained psychologists and psychiatrists who can assist as well.
Nice. Could you tell us a little more about your involvement with the Australian Psychedelic Society, and what resources are available for people who are curious about psychedelics?
Yeah, absolutely. So the APS, or the Australian Psychedelic Society, so it's a charity, it's a non-profit. We're Australia-wide. We have chapters in most major cities, and we have lots of smaller ones popping up as well. It's a little bit like a grassroots community fostering organisation. So you've been to some of our meetups in New Farm Park. So every third Sunday of the month we do a little gathering there. It's really relaxed and informal. People come and have a picnic. It's family friendly, and usually we'll have a guest speaker. I've had you speak about your last conference there, which was wonderful. I've given a few talks. We get other people in too. If you look at the APS national website, there's lots of articles, there's lots of resources there that people can find. So that's a great place to start, the national website. Then you've got Mind Medicine Australia is another big key player in Australia. And then aside from that, if you want information and resources, Erowid is one I'd recommend. And that's the place where I learned about all those experience reports when I was younger. It's this huge international repository of experiences where people all over the world have had an experience, and then they submit it, and then you can read about what other people have done. And it's really fascinating to see the range of experiences. And then there's also lots of other information and harm minimization stuff there as well. So between those three, that would give anyone a really solid set of options for learning more.
Fantastic. So where do you see psychedelic medicine heading in Australia over the next 5 years?
I expect that it's only going to accelerate. The evidence is getting stronger and stronger all the time. We've been researching this for a long time now. We had a pause because of the crackdown that happened after that big surge of interest in the 60s and 70s, but it's all coming back again, and it has been for a couple of decades. So yeah, I think it's just going to be more and more integrated into our current mental health system. It'll just take a bit of time and setting up the infrastructure, and hopefully getting it subsidized by Medicare. Hopefully that'll happen as well.
So in that field, what gives you hope, and what challenges do you think we need to overcome?
The hope is just how obviously beneficial and powerful these medicines are. There really isn't any question left, and there hasn't been for a very long time. We know they work. We know they can cause profound changes to people that are suffering deeply. This could save countries millions and millions of dollars in lost productivity and mental health costs. You know, consider how incredible it is that you could treat long-term treatment-resistant depression with a few psychedelic-assisted sessions. Compare that to a lifetime of antidepressants and medicines and talking therapy and alternative therapies and psychiatrists and all the time and money. You know, like that's the hope. It's going to save lives and improve lives in a huge way. So that's the hope. The challenges, I think, there's a few. So one is just making sure that we have all the infrastructure and the training for professionals to be able to deliver and use these medicines effectively. There's also the stigma to work through, and it gets political. You know, you see political debates when they touch on drugs. It almost seems a bit more like they're trying to use it to leverage certain voter populations rather than really caring about the potential of the medicine itself. It's an easy sort of pawn politically in that way because it's not well understood by many people. But hopefully we'll see an increasing openness from governments and policymakers, and it's really inevitable. You know, the mountain of evidence is just growing bigger and bigger, and it's going to get to a point where, like, frankly, if you try to say psychedelics are bad and we need to ban them, you're just going to look like a fool because the evidence is just so blindingly strong and the potential good is so profound. But that'll take time. It'll take time, evidence, infrastructure, to making sure we get it right and do this safely.
So what are you particularly passionate about when it comes to psychedelics?
I'm passionate about, well, I guess what I said with the hope. I'm really passionate about how much it can help people because, you know, in my work I don't administer psychedelics, but I do the integration work, and then most of my clients I see, there's nothing to do with psychedelics. It's just, you know, normal psychology sessions. But even in that work, I see, and I see this in colleagues and the evidence as well, that, you know, straight talking therapy, you know, whilst effective, it's when I compare what I see there with what I see from some of the psychedelic trials and the outcomes and the reports I see just how much benefit this can cause for people if done right. So that excites me, and that makes me want to be a part of this because, you know, I don't really care about the money side of it so much. You know, as long as I can live comfortably, like, I want to create as much good for as many people as I can, and I think that's an attitude I picked up from that monk that I travelled with, of, you know, do the best thing you can in each moment, and psychedelics seems like a really profound way to help a lot of people.
If you were to teach on a particular topic which perhaps doesn't exist yet, what would that be?
That's something I've actually thought about, and one thing that I'm really passionate about is the spiritual side of my life and my psychology. So I've explored many different spiritual systems, including religions and smaller sort of niche systems, and that combined with my formal study in philosophy and psychology and my own inner explorations through meditating, lucid dreaming and psychedelics, I formed a perspective on reality and a kind of unique spiritual perspective, which I think is very scientifically compatible, but also holds the same kind of real profundity that you get from, you know, many other systems. I want to find a way to help other people develop a spiritual, sacred perspective on reality that doesn't depend on making any kind of supernatural assumptions or believing in any kind of anything that you can't verify for yourself. I think that would be a really fun thing to teach about, but I think that'll be a later project for me.
Fantastic. So, using plants as medicine, 2024, how was it for you?
It was fantastic, and I'm not just saying that because I'm talking at the next one. It was a wonderful experience. I remember we had the APS stall there, and we were giving out the pamphlets and harm minimization, and we had a drug interaction chart there for people as well. But seeing all the other people that you brought together, all the other stalls and the music, and how much you could learn from all these different experts as well, not to mention the sense of community that you managed to foster. You know, you remember that last night when you got everyone in a circle and there was a little speaking circle. I'll never forget, there were people crying there, saying they'd finally found their tribe and they'd never seen anything or experienced anything like this. So, like, genuinely, it was an incredible experience, which is why I'm so delighted that you've invited me to come back and speak again this year.
Fantastic. So what can people expect from the event this year? What would you bring for us?
Well, you mean myself, my talk?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the latest science and evidence to do with psychedelic-assisted therapy, because it is such a fast-moving field, as we've been talking about throughout this whole conversation. It's a little hard to keep track of for most people, and I want to share as much useful information as I can at the conference to help people understand what are the ways to access these medicines, what are the options, what can they use to be treated, to treat, you know, depression, anxiety, PTSD, what are some of the hazards to look out for, what do we think of some of the illicit ways of doing it. You know, there are people out there that, and this is another challenge with the field, there are people offering this, you know, outside of legal frameworks. What do we do with that, you know, and what are the dangers with that? And yeah, just really focusing on where the science is, some really interesting, surprising facts that people probably won't know, even if they are psychonauts. And then a little bit of a glimpse of what the future might hold as well.
Nice. I'm curious about harm minimization. Could you talk to us a little bit about that when it comes to psychedelics?
Yeah. So this is it's a big one, and it's central to everything the APS does, and everything I do when I speak about psychedelics too, is that we don't want people getting hurt, we don't want people doing dangerous things, not to mention breaking the law, which has its own many hazards. You know, you could potentially cause a lot of problems for your own life by doing that, so that's just one of the reasons to be careful. But even in these sort of safe clinical settings, you know, we just want people to be educated, properly screened, and to make sure that they're getting the best benefit they can whilst avoiding some of the potential hazards.
Yeah. So do you think there are some petitions that we should organize perhaps at the conference that could be useful or beneficial?
It wouldn't hurt, and I can have a bit of a look around and see if there's anything currently going as well at the time of the conference, because I think the more people that add their voice to this and put their hand up and say, hey, I actually would like to see more of this in our medical system, the more that people in the population do that, the more likely it is, I think, that we'll start to actually see that come to fruition.
You're quite an accomplished musician. You play a variety of instruments. Have psychedelics in any way contributed or perhaps enhanced your skills in playing music?
It's an interesting one. I'd say probably not like long term. Like there's no real substitute for just, you know, doing the hours and doing the practice. But having said that, there have been times, and you know, I'm echoing the words of many musicians here. You know, think like Hendrix and Beatles and whatnot. Like, I'm not the only one to say that when I have been in an altered state of consciousness and played music, often I've felt that it just flows so much easier, or I find patterns and shapes that I've never used or thought of before. And I think some of this is speaking to, one, being able to access these flow states more easily, and second, the kind of creativity and the neuroplasticity that comes with being on a psychedelic, and that translating into seeing more creative possibilities on the instrument itself. So I've noticed those kind of effects, and when I've discovered a new thing, then I remember it afterwards. But by and large, it's been practice. It's more like they can give you little moments of peak experience. Mm-hmm.
So could you tell us a little bit about neuroplasticity, and also which psychedelics can contribute to that?
Yeah, well, neuroplasticity is it's basically the brain's ability to change and modify itself. So the brain is incredibly complex. We're still just beginning to understand how it works. But you've got all these neurons that are interconnected with each other and transferring information, and neuroplasticity allows for new connections and even new like rewiring of the brain, essentially. So that's neuroplasticity, and that correlates with some of the dramatic changes we see with symptoms. So in that highly neuroplastic state, like when you're on a psychedelic doing therapy, when you're processing a trauma memory, for example, and coming up with new perspectives or integrating the memories, your brain is literally more malleable, in that neuroplastic kind of way, so that when you change those connections and memories and update your thoughts and beliefs, then they kind of set like that, to put it crudely, after the session, which we think accounts for at least a lot of the healing that comes from psychedelics. And when it comes to which ones cause this, as far as I know, pretty much all the main ones seem to, like psilocybin, LSD, mescaline, ketamine, they all lead to an increase in acute neuroplasticity.
Are there substances outside of psychedelics that can cause or create neuroplasticity?
Yeah, absolutely. There's many, in fact, and they do it in different ways and to different degrees. One example is there's a family of drugs called nootropics. So you've got things like piracetam, aniracetam, pramiracetam. They're not psychedelic because they're not mind-altering substances, but they also cause neuroplasticity. Like even lithium orotate, you can access that legally in Australia. Not the full lithium that they give people with bipolar, but lithium orotate, that increases neuroplasticity as well. There's a long list of these things. But combining the neuroplasticity with the profound psychological experience allows for the psychological changes to lead to brain changes. I think that's the important combo that you're getting there.
Events like using plants as medicine, the conference, do you think there's a need for such events, and if so, why?
Oh, absolutely, definitely, because it is still a budding, developing field, and there's many people, as we've been talking about, who want and need medicine. These events give a beautiful opportunity for people to come together, meet others, to learn, to connect, and to then go away with a greater understanding of what to do next in terms of accessing medicine, or signing a petition, or even just changing their perspective and helping inform others, which creates its own ripple effect to hopefully help this become more of an accessible pathway for people that need it.
Which psychedelics have you found particularly useful for people who've had trauma, which maybe affects their sleep, their eating habits? Have you come across anything?
Yeah. So MDMA and psilocybin are the ones being looked most closely at for trauma. Ketamine for depression is well researched now and highly effective for many people that try it. And then you've got all these other ones like ayahuasca and ibogaine and mescaline, and those ones tend to carry a bit more of a side effect profile, which I think is why they haven't been used as much in the research. But there's many others too that I have no doubt will just be more and more studied as time goes by.
Mm-hmm. Where next for you on your journey with psychedelics, or as a psychologist, where would you go next?
It's a good question. So I think for now I'm just focusing on my private client work and enjoying my office, which I've recently created here. So I'm doing that for a little bit. But I have intentions to do more with the APS Brisbane chapter and start creating more events for that. If anyone wants to find out, you can just look that up on Facebook. You just look up the Australian Psychedelic Society Brisbane chapter. I also want to get more involved in research again as well. So I'm going to start putting feelers out and looking at research projects that are happening and see if I can do some good work there as well. So ideally a blend of science and research, practice and research.
I see. How can people get in touch with you?
If they want to find out more about me, best place to do so is to just go to my website, which is dradventureheart.com. No hyphen, no punctuation, just dradventureheart.com.
So, in closing, is there anything you would like to share with our audiences today?
I think the main thing is to be safety cautious, but don't let it lead to too much paranoia, and just to really emphasize that message that we're really in an exciting time here where we're exploring in a more responsible and careful way than ever before how these medicines can be used to transform lives, and that to me is profoundly exciting.
Fantastic. I look forward to having you join us at Using Plants as Medicine 2025, and also for the music jam where we shall play some music together.
Yes, I can't wait for that. That'll be great.
Fantastic. We shall see you there.
Lovely. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you. Thank you.